Back when I was 21, I often stayed alone in my parents' lakefront home. Our backyard opened directly onto a small, murky pond, and on the far side, a quiet park stood shrouded in darkness most nights. Our neighbors' houses were spaced out, large properties that lent a sense of isolation. It was a summer night, the kind that felt thick with warmth, and I was home on break from college. My parents' jobs kept them away, and I had the house to myself. I loved the sunroom at night, the cool breeze through the screens, and the comforting hum of summer insects. I had just settled onto the corner of the couch, wrapped in a cozy throw, the glow of the TV flickering in the dim room, when I heard a splash. At first, I assumed it was just a duck or a fish, but the sound was too heavy. It repeated irregularly, like something large moving through the water, and I felt a cold unease seep into my skin. I lowered the TV volume, listening intently. When the splashing continued, I pressed my ear to the window, straining to hear. This time, I caught something else, a low, rhythmic humming like a tuneless murmur. I decided to investigate, stepping onto the back deck and turning on the floodlights. They flickered, casting long shadows across the lawn, revealing only a sliver of the pond. The moment the lights hit the water, the splashing and the humming abruptly stopped. My skin prickled with the sense that whoever, or whatever, had been in the pond had seen me. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the night or a wayward swimmer, but unease gnawed at me. Back inside, I locked the door and tried to focus on my show. But every few minutes, my gaze drifted to the darkened window, my mind conjuring images of shadowy figures slipping through the trees. Then came the sound that shattered any sense of calm, a soft, deliberate shuffle from the deck. My pulse quickened, the TV's light casting a pale blue glow that made me feel exposed, as though whoever was outside could see me perfectly while I was blind to their presence. Panicking, I fumbled for the remote, turning the TV off. As the darkness swallowed the room, I could hear it more clearly, a slow, heavy breathing just outside the window. I flattened myself against the couch, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, a voice, deep and deliberate, rasped from the other side of the glass. "I see you." A chill ran through my entire body, a visceral terror that left me paralyzed. Desperation clawed at my throat, and I forced out, "Paul, is that you?" Hoping it was my neighbor playing some sick joke. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then I heard footsteps, barefoot, heavy, retreating across the deck. They stopped abruptly, and I knew, somehow, that the person hadn't truly left. The darkness outside seemed alive with intent, pressing against the windows. The minutes crawled by before I found the courage to check the locks again, gripping a kitchen knife as I moved from door to door. My dad, over the phone, urged me to go outside and check for anyone, but every bone in my body screamed against the idea. Still, I flipped on the backyard lights one more time and stepped onto the deck. That's when I saw them, wet footprints, the imprints of bare feet, trailing around the deck's edge, leading to the corner where the shadows clung thickest. And there, just peeking over the edge of the deck, I saw eyes, two gleaming orbs staring back at me. I backed away, tripping over my own feet, and dashed back inside, dialing 911. The police arrived quickly, their lights flooding the backyard, making everything look surreal and distorted. They found nothing, of course, no trace of the man or any clue of who he might have been. But those footprints stayed with me, a reminder that, for one night, I was not truly alone in that house. A few years back, I moved into a small house perched on the edge of a sleepy town. The kind of place where neighbors kept to themselves, where the nights were quiet, and the air always seemed still. I liked the solitude. Most days, it was easy to unwind in the evenings with no noise beyond the hum of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. One Friday evening, after a long day at work, I came home to a gray sky and the scent of rain in the air. I locked the front door behind me, let my shoes clatter to the floor, and headed into the kitchen to whip up a simple dinner. I wasn't expecting company, so I planned to curl up on the couch and lose myself in a favorite old movie. Dinner finished, I wrapped myself in a blanket and settled in front of the TV, the familiar scenes playing out before me like an old friend. But soon, sleep crept up, my eyelids growing heavy. I was just drifting off when a sound broke through the TV's low murmur, a faint, deliberate scratching. It crawled under my skin, tugging me back into the present with a sudden, sharp awareness. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the side of the house. But the scratching came again, closer this time, like fingers dragging across the wall just beyond the window. My pulse quickened, and the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching long and strange across the floor. I muted the TV, the silence of the house suddenly oppressive, each creak of the old building amplified. The sound shifted, moving to the back door, and with it came a realization that sent a chill through my veins. Someone was trying to get inside. Frozen on the couch, I barely dared to breathe. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it an animal? A prank? Or something more sinister? The scratching stopped, and for a moment, I let myself believe it was over. But then came the unmistakable rattle of the back door handle. I felt like my heart might burst out of my chest. Panic surged through me, and I forced myself off the couch, creeping toward the kitchen where my phone lay on the counter. Each step felt like a thunderclap in the silence, and I cursed myself for leaving the back door unlocked. As I reached for my phone, the back door creaked open, a groan of wood against rusted hinges. My breath caught in my throat. I ducked behind the kitchen counter, hands trembling as I dialed 911. I could hear the faint, rhythmic thud of footsteps inside the house now. Slow, deliberate, moving through each room like they were looking for something or someone. I whispered my address to the dispatcher, barely audible, and hung up, praying the police would arrive before the intruder found me. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen door, and the silence that followed was so thick I could hear my own racing heartbeat. I clutched a frying pan from the stove, desperate and knowing I couldn't wait to be found. I caught sight of a shadow moving along the floor, growing closer. Just as I gripped the pan tighter, preparing to strike, the footsteps resumed, moving away from the kitchen and toward the front of the house. Relief flooded through me, and I dared a peek over the counter. I caught a glimpse of a figure, cloaked in darkness, stepping through the front door just as the sound of distant sirens grew louder. The door swung shut behind them, leaving me alone in the silence. The only evidence of their presence, the wet prints trailing across the floor. When the police arrived, they found no one outside, no trace of the intruder. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and even now, I can't help but glance toward the back door every night, wondering if one evening I'll hear that sound again. I have a dog, Benny. Every night, I take him for a walk before bed, always along the same route. It's a short loop through our condominium's parking lot, past a row of streetlights that cast shadows long and dark across the asphalt. It's a quiet neighborhood, the kind where the biggest worry is whether the mail gets wet when it rains. But one night, something changed. It was late, probably past midnight, when Benny and I set out for our usual walk. The parking lot was empty, as always, but the air felt heavier, charged with a strange tension. I had my flashlight with me, and one earbud in, my music playing softly as we walked. Halfway through our route, I thought I heard a voice, a faint murmur carried by the wind, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. At first, I brushed it off, trying to convince myself it was the music, or maybe a trick of my tired mind. But then I heard it again, a single word, spoken softly but with a deliberate clarity. Help. My chest tightened, and I froze, turning off my music and listening in the thick silence. Benny's ears perked up too, his head turning toward the sound. The voice came again, a low, muffled plea that seemed to drift from the shadows between the parked cars. I swept my flashlight in that direction, my hands trembling slightly. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. Just a line of silent vehicles, their dark windows reflecting back the pale light. The word echoed in my head, help, spoken without urgency, like someone testing out a word they didn't fully understand. I felt a knot of unease twist tighter in my stomach. Part of me wanted to walk away, but another part, the stubborn, rational part, insisted I had to see if there was truly someone in need. I took a tentative step closer to the line of cars, scanning for any sign of movement, any glimpse of a face or a shadow shifting behind tinted glass. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. But the only response was the creak of a branch swaying in the wind. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, this time closer, the voice coming from just beyond a parked SUV. The tone was wrong, though. It was hollow, flat, almost like a recording being played back. And as I strained to see into the darkness, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice didn't sound like a child's at all. It sounded like someone trying to imitate a child. Benny let out a low growl, his hackles rising, and that's when I decided I had heard enough. I grabbed his leash and bolted back toward my building, not daring to look back. My mind raced with questions. Had it been a trick? Was someone watching me, trying to lure me closer? Back in the safety of my apartment, I locked the door behind me and called the police, trying to explain what I had heard. They assured me they would check the area, but their tone told me they thought I was overreacting. But I know what I heard. To this day, I avoid that part of the parking lot after dark. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I think I hear that voice again, a soft, distorted echo slipping through the night, calling out a word it doesn't quite understand. When I was searching for a car to buy my son for his 18th birthday, I turned to all the usual sites, cars.com, eBay Motors, but everything seemed overpriced. Eventually, I found a listing on Craigslist, a 2003 Toyota Camry with just 67,000 miles. The car looked well-maintained in the photos, and the price, $3,500, seemed like a bargain. The seller's name was Bob, and he lived about 10 miles away. We arranged for me to come see the car, and he seemed polite enough over the phone. On the day of the meeting, I arrived at Bob's address a little early, driving down a secluded dirt road that led to a small house surrounded by dense woods. The garage door was open, revealing piles of car parts, but the Camry I'd come to see wasn't in sight. There was just an old, beaten-up pickup truck in the driveway. I got out of my car, feeling an inexplicable unease as I glanced around the quiet property. It was too isolated. Still, I knocked on the front door, expecting to meet Bob. No answer. I knocked again, waiting longer, then tried calling him. The phone rang, and I could hear it, ringing from inside the house. Now I was certain I had the right address, but there was no sign of anyone. A chill settled in the pit of my stomach. I considered leaving, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked to the side of the house, peering through a dusty window into a dimly lit room. The dining room looked frozen in time, with a table set for a dinner that never happened. And then I saw him, someone standing at the back door, staring out into the woods. At first, relief washed over me, thinking it must be Bob. I tapped on the window, but he didn't move, didn't even flinch. That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. The figure didn't respond because it wasn't alive. It was a man, a taxidermied man, propped up like a grotesque mannequin in the corner of the room. Panic gripped me, and I backed away, my mind racing. Who was this Bob? And why was he leading strangers to this remote house? As I stumbled back toward my car, I saw movement from the edge of the garage, a shadow slipping out of sight, just quick enough to make me question if I'd really seen it. I didn't wait for answers. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away down that lonely dirt road, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing after me. I never reported what I found, and I never found out what the truth behind that taxidermied figure was. But sometimes when I drive past isolated roads, or see an old listing on Craigslist, I wonder how many others might have followed Bob's directions to that house, and how many might never have left. Years ago, I moved into a new apartment with my girlfriend, Jenny. It was a modest place, but we liked it well enough. For the first few months, everything was fine, but then Jenny began having terrible sleep paralysis. She said it always started the same. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling a weight pressing down on her chest. She often described seeing a shadowy figure standing in the corner of our bedroom, just watching. At first, I thought it was just nightmares. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before, and it matched the description. But then she started waking me up during these episodes, and I began to notice something else. On nights when she woke me, I could swear I saw a shadow shifting near the bedroom door, just for a second, before it disappeared into the darkness. I never told Jenny about what I saw. I didn't want to scare her, and I convinced myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, that it was just the afterimage of a nightmare. But one night, when she woke me up, I saw it again, a shape crouched over her like it was pressing down on her chest. For a moment, the room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy and thick with something unspoken. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. Jenny gasped as she came out of her paralysis, and I pretended everything was fine, but I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and strained conversations. I kept hoping the episodes would stop, that things would go back to normal, but the fear that something might be lurking in our home gnawed at me. Jenny began to sense my unease, even though I never told her the full truth. One evening, I came home late from work to find the apartment eerily quiet. The silence felt almost purposeful, like the house was holding its breath. I called out to Jenny, but she didn't answer. When I found her in the bedroom, she was standing perfectly still, staring at the open closet door. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It was in there. It's always in there." A chill ran through me, but I forced a laugh, dismissing her fears as just bad dreams. Yet even as I said it, I could feel the darkness in that closet, pressing against my back, almost as if it was listening. That night, I locked the closet door. But even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes, feeling that same weight on my chest, as if a shadow is watching from the corner, waiting for me to acknowledge it. It happened when I was 17 or 18, during one of those summer nights that feel like they'll stretch on forever. My friends and I decided to camp out in the woods near our hometown, a sprawling nature preserve that felt like it could swallow you whole if you wandered too deep. Chuck was the camping expert, always ready with his industrial flashlight and endless supply of knots. Jackson, on the other hand, was the designated supplier of drinks. The three of us trudged through the underbrush, guided by Chuck's flashlight, until we found a clearing far from any trails. The night was perfect, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, leaving you feeling like the only people in the world. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled in with our drinks. Hours passed as we traded stories, the flames crackling in the cool night air. Just as we were about to call it a night, a piercing whistle cut through the darkness. It was high-pitched and eerie, coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of our firelight. I froze, my grip tightening around my drink, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Chuck aimed his flashlight into the woods, but the beam revealed nothing but the gnarled shapes of trees. "Probably just some kids messing around," Jackson said, though his voice lacked conviction. But then the whistle came again, closer this time. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. Jackson shut off the music, and we all strained to hear. The forest seemed to press in around us, the silence suddenly too thick, too expectant. "Let's just pack up and leave," I suggested, but Chuck shook his head. "We're too deep in. It'd take us an hour to find the trail in the dark." Reluctantly, we tried to ignore the unease settling over us, pretending everything was fine. But just as we thought the sounds had stopped, a shadow shifted at the edge of the clearing, human-shaped, but unnaturally still, as if it was watching. Before any of us could react, the shadow melted back into the trees, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. Chuck's flashlight scanned the darkness frantically, but we found nothing, no footprints, no signs of movement. Yet the whistle sounded one last time, low and mocking, sending a shiver through all of us. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled close to the fire, but none of us spoke about what we thought we saw. By the time morning light crept through the trees, we were already packing up, eager to leave that place behind. Even now, I sometimes think I hear that whistle when I walk through the woods near my home, and every time, I can't shake the feeling that whatever watched us that night in the forest might still be out there, waiting. It was a warm fall evening when my girlfriend Jenny and I moved into a small, cozy house tucked away in the countryside of Texas. We thought it would be a fresh start, a place where we could leave behind the rush of city life and find some peace. The house stood on a large plot, surrounded by fields that stretched out for acres, broken only by the distant silhouette of trees. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. We spent our evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. But then strange things started to happen. Jenny began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, saying she felt like something was pressing down on her chest. She would describe a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just watching her. At first, I dismissed it as stress or sleep paralysis, things I'd read about online. But one night, she woke me up with her rapid, panicked breaths. When I opened my eyes, I saw it too, a shape darker than the night, looming over her, its form bending unnaturally toward the bed. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached out instinctively, grabbing her arm. The moment my hand touched her, the shadow seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only the darkness of the room. Jenny was shaking, clutching at me, asking if I had seen it too. But I lied. I told her it was just a trick of the light, that it was her imagination. I didn't want to scare her, didn't want to admit that I had no idea what I had seen, or if it had been real at all. The next few weeks were uneasy. The air in the house seemed different, heavier, like it was charged with something I couldn't quite understand. I found myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I passed the hallway mirror, half expecting to see that shadow standing behind me. Then one night, when I came home late from work, I found the house in darkness. The power had gone out during a storm, leaving everything cloaked in shadow. I called out to Jenny, but there was no reply. I found her huddled in the bedroom, clutching a flashlight. She told me she had heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for something. She was certain it wasn't her imagination this time. I grabbed the flashlight from her, trying to keep my voice steady as I promised to check the house. But as I moved down the hallway, the beam of light flickering across the empty rooms, I felt that same oppressive presence, a weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. When I reached the end of the hallway, I turned back toward the bedroom. And there, just outside the door, I saw it a figure almost blending into the shadows, its form barely more than a blur. For a second, we locked eyes, and in that instant, I felt a wave of cold, like something ancient and unseen brushing past me. But when I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving me alone with the sound of Jenny's fearful breathing. We moved out of that house soon after, leaving behind whatever haunted those darkened hallways. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still wake up to the memory of those cold, watchful eyes, and I wonder if I'll ever truly escape them. A few years back, I rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway. It was one of those Airbnb listings that felt like a steal, isolated, quiet, nestled deep in the Arizona desert. The photos made it look charming, and the price was far cheaper than any hotel I could find. The thought of being alone with my thoughts for a few days was a welcome change, or so I thought. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent the day exploring the nearby trails, soaking in the heat of the sun, feeling the desert's vast emptiness. But that night, as I sat in the living room with my laptop, practicing answers for an upcoming job interview, I heard a sound, a soft tap, tap on the window behind me. At first, I dismissed it. The desert had a way of playing tricks on the ears, with the wind swirling through the scrub. But then it came again, a deliberate knock that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I turned, but all I saw through the window was darkness, the outline of cacti barely visible under the moonlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept closer, pressing my face to the glass. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks. But a nagging thought whispered that I wasn't truly alone out there, that somewhere beyond the edge of the porch light, something watched. The next day, I couldn't shake the unease, even as I tried to enjoy the desert's rugged beauty. By nightfall, I was back in the cabin, more weary than before. I double-checked the locks, kept the curtains drawn, and settled in a bed with my laptop, trying to focus on a TV show. But then, just as my eyelids grew heavy, I heard it again, a click like someone pressing their tongue against the roof of their mouth. It came from the closet, a sound that was too deliberate, too close. My heart nearly stopped. The darkness in the room seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all sides. I forced myself out of bed, clutching my phone in one hand, and slowly opened the closet door. The small space was empty, but the air inside felt colder, as if someone or something had been there watching. The rest of that night, I kept every light in the cabin on. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence that had become too complete, too still. Every creak, every shift of the wind against the walls felt like a whisper of something waiting just beyond the light's reach. When morning came, I packed up and left, cutting my trip short. I never reported what I heard, or the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. But I wonder, even now, if whoever or whatever had been out there followed me, slipping through the shadows, waiting for a moment when I might let my guard down again. Back when I was a kid, I lived in a small town in Georgia, surrounded by woods on all sides. My family had a big, old house, the kind with too many rooms and too many places where shadows could linger. It had been in the family for generations, a 2-story relic with creaky floorboards and tall windows that seemed to look out into the endless woods like unblinking eyes. I'd always been a little afraid of the house at night. The way the floors creaked, the way the wind moaned through the trees outside, twisting their shadows across the walls. But what happened one summer evening left a mark that never really faded. It started with my night light. It was one of those cheap plug-ins with a red bulb that cast a warm glow across the room. I liked to fall asleep to that comforting red light, letting it wash over me and push away the darkness that always seemed to press in from the edges of the room. My parents, practical as they were, humored my childish fears and let me keep it, even as I grew older. One night, I woke up to find the light had changed to a pale blue. The air in the room felt colder, like a draft was sneaking in through the cracks in the window frame, and the shadows seemed to dance just beyond the light's reach. I lay there, confused and blinking away the fog of sleep, staring at that unfamiliar hue. At first, I thought my parents had swapped the bulb as a joke. My dad was always pulling little pranks to keep me on my toes. But when I asked them the next morning, they insisted they hadn't touched it. Their confusion was genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in my room while I slept. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it, convincing myself it was just a dream, or maybe a strange quirk of the bulb itself. But then it happened again. A few nights later, I woke to the same strange blue glow, but this time, the night light wasn't plugged in. It was lying in the middle of the floor, the cord coiled neatly beside it like someone had placed it there intentionally. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end as I stared at that tiny object in the dark, half expecting it to move on its own. I ran to my parents' room, clutching the unplugged night light like a talisman. They listened, their faces weary from sleep, and tried to reassure me. My dad even came back to my room, plugged the nightlight back in, and sat with me until I dozed off. He thought it was a loose socket, he said, but his voice wavered slightly, and I noticed the way his eyes darted toward the closet door, just like mine did. But I knew better. I could feel that something was wrong, that the shadows in my room seemed to move just a little too much at night, twisting and shifting like they had a life of their own. I started shutting my closet door each night before bed, pressing it firmly into the frame, listening for the soft click that meant it was fully closed. But that only seemed to make things worse. The real terror came a week later, in the early hours of the morning. I woke suddenly, my mouth dry, the room pitch black except for the thin sliver of moonlight slipping through the curtains. For a moment, I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me, when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the closet. It was soft, like the sound of fabric brushing against the wooden shelves inside, but in the dead silence of the house, it might as well have been a thunderclap. My body went rigid, every muscle locked in place as my mind raced with possibilities. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see it, then whatever was in the closet wouldn't see me. But the sound continued, slow and steady, as if something was moving inside, shifting through the clothes and old toys I kept stored in there. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, so loud I was sure that whatever was in the closet could hear it too. When the rustling stopped, a new sound filled the room, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone was muttering just beneath their breath. It was so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but as I strained to listen, I could make out words, though they made no sense, garbled syllables that twisted together in a way that sent a shiver through my bones. Desperation clawed at me, and I forced myself to turn my head, just a little, just enough to peek at the closet. Through the sliver of moonlight, I could see that the door was open, just a crack. A blackness deeper than the shadows of the room seemed to spill out from that narrow opening, a void that seemed to drink in the light and stretch toward my bed like a living thing. I shut my eyes tight again, fighting the urge to scream, to call for my parents, but some deep, primal instinct told me that making a sound would be the worst mistake I could make. Instead, I lay there, frozen in fear, my breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts, until I heard it, the door creaking slowly shut. It clicked into place, the sound echoing in the silence, and the whispering stopped. In the morning, my closet door was ajar, though I'd always made sure to close it tight, and the nightlight was gone again, disappeared as if it had never existed. My parents tried to reassure me, telling me it must have rolled under the bed or gotten misplaced, but I knew the truth. Something had taken it, something that came from the darkness of that closet, and it was still watching me. I tried to avoid my room as much as possible after that, spending my evenings in the living room or outside until my parents insisted it was time for bed. But every night, I felt that same weight pressing against my chest, that sense that the darkness in my room was hiding something far more sinister than the shadows cast by the trees outside. I even started sleeping with the lights on, but it made no difference. The feeling of being watched never went away, as if the shadows themselves were leaning over me, breathing down my neck. A few nights before my 12th birthday, I woke to find my reflection staring back at me from the mirror across the room. The moonlight illuminated just enough for me to see my own wide, frightened eyes. But as I watched, my reflection blinked, and I realized with a cold rush of terror that I hadn't moved. My reflection's lips curled into a smile, slow and deliberate, as if it knew something I didn't. And then, in the darkness of the mirror, I saw it, a shadow shifting behind my reflection, leaning in closer, just before the room was swallowed by darkness once more. I screamed then, the sound finally tearing from my throat, and my parents came running, turning on every light in the room. They found me trembling in the corner, my eyes fixed on the mirror, but when they looked, there was nothing there. My dad tried to show me that it was just my imagination, but I could see the unease in his eyes. They moved my bed out of that room the next day, but the damage was done. Even now, years later, I avoid mirrors in dark rooms, and I keep my closet door firmly shut no matter where I live. My parents sold that old house soon after, but the memories followed me, lingering like shadows at the edge of my vision. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the reflection in my bedroom mirror, a whisper of darkness that reminds me that some things never really go away. Hey there! Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you